The wind off the Nevada desert smelled like alkali dust and engine grease, and it hit Nora Calloway the moment they shoved her off the wagon onto the cracked earth of Dustin's flat. She had Danny pressed against her chest, 18 months old, heavy with sleep, his small fingers twisted into the collar of her blouse, and she used the impact of landing to curl around him, so her shoulder took the ground instead of his head. Nobody in the crowd outside the Territorial Land Office noticed, or if they didn't say anything. This was 1911, late enough in the century that men were supposed to know better. Late enough that the railroad had already carved Nevada into manageable pieces, that motor cars were appearing on the roads of Reno, that women in the eastern cities were marching for the vote. But out here in the high desert, where the last cattle barons were selling off parcels and the mining companies were still extracting what they could before the ore ran out, certain old arrangements died slow and ugly. Nora had been married to Roy Calloway for 3 years. She had not known about the debt until after he was dead. The mine foreman read the terms from a paper she was not allowed to touch. Roy had borrowed $1,100 from the Garrett Land and Cattle Company against his labor contract. Roy was gone a cave-in at the Silverpick mine, quick enough that he hadn't suffered, or so they told her, which she supposed was meant to be comfort. The debt transferred by the terms of the contract to his surviving household. Nora was the surviving household. Danny was too young to be considered anything except a liability. The Garrett Company's solution was a labor assignment. Nora would work off the debt at one of 3 company properties. She could choose which one, they said, as if that made it a choice. She was still trying to understand what was happening to her when a man she'd never seen, thick-necked, soft around the middle, wearing a suit that cost more than Roy had earned in 6 months, called out a number. 3 years, Garrett terms. I'll take her for the Elko operation. She understood then. The foreman shuffled his papers. Another voice, this one from the back of the loose gathering of men near the land office steps. Debt buyout. Full settlement. Cash. The soft man turned around. Who the hell? Cash, the voice repeated. Calm. The way a man is calm when he doesn't feel the need to explain himself. Nora looked. He was standing near a truck, a Ford Model T, travel-worn, with a bedroll strapped to the running board. Tall, lean in the way of men who worked outside and forgot to eat regularly. He had a hat that had been through weather, a canvas jacket, and the kind of stillness that looked like patience but she suspected was something else, something more controlled. His eyes, when he looked at her, were a light, unremarkable brown, the color of creek water in winter. 1100, he said, still looking at the foreman and not at her. I'll give you 12 to cover processing. I want the contract voided, not transferred. The foreman's mouth opened. Today, the man added. His name, she learned, while the paperwork was being redone inside the land office, was Cole Briggs. He ran a cattle and farming operation called Harlan's Reach, 60 miles northeast, up into the basin country where the land flattened and the grass came back stronger than anyone expected after the drought years. He had driven down to Dustin's flat for a different reason entirely, a parts order for his well pump, and had overheard the Garrett Company arrangement being described in the saloon the night before. Why? Nora asked him. She was sitting on the land office steps because her legs had stopped cooperating. Danny was awake now, watching the strange man with the solemn attention toddlers give to things they haven't categorized yet. Cole leaned against the truck and considered the question. Same reason you'd pull a dog out of a ditch, he said. It was in front of me. Men don't pay $1,200 for dogs. That's because dogs can't negotiate. She looked up at him. You can have conditions, he said. Write them yourself if you want. I've got paper in the truck. She stared at him long enough to understand he was serious. Then she said, I work a fair wage, and I keep it. You don't have a claim on my person. I leave when I decide to leave, not when you decide I should. And Danny stays with me. Yes, to all of it. He said it without hesitation, which was either the most trustworthy thing she'd ever heard or the most suspicious. She hadn't decided which. You cook or keep accounts? Both. Good. I need both. He opened the truck door. You want to drive or ride? She had never been in a motor car in her life. Ride, she said. The drive to Harlan's Reach took most of the afternoon. The road turned to track and the track turned to suggestion, and eventually they were moving through sage and bunch grass with the mountains at their backs going purple in the late light. Cole didn't talk much, which she found she didn't mind. Danny fell asleep against her arm. She watched the country change, and kept her mind very deliberately on practical things, what she would observe, what she would need to evaluate, what would tell her whether she'd made a mistake or a different kind of mistake. The ranch appeared around the last rise. It was bigger than she'd expected. A main house built of stone and timber, a long barn, a bunkhouse, a spring house, a garden that was losing the fight with autumn but showed signs of having been tended seriously. Beyond it, pastures reaching toward the basin, cattle moving slow in the last light. A woman came out of the barn as they pulled up. 60s, iron-gray hair pulled back without fuss, a leather apron over her dress. She looked at the truck and then at Nora and Danny with eyes that didn't give anything away. "This is Pearl," Cole said. "She's been here longer than the fences." "That's not saying much," Pearl said. "He replaced the east fence 2 years ago." But she was looking at Danny with an expression Nora couldn't quite read. And before Nora had fully stepped down from the truck, Pearl had already said, "Baby's hungry. Come inside." It was not a question. Nora decided she liked Pearl. The kitchen was warm. The stove was a beauty, a cast-iron Monarch range that someone had maintained with genuine care. Pearl put food on the table without ceremony. Cold beef, bread, a jar of peaches, coffee. Danny ate peaches with both hands and made a mess that Pearl watched with the careful attention of someone who had once had small children and missed them without saying so. Cole ate quickly and excused himself to check on the stock. Pearl sat down across from Nora. "You know what you walked into?" Pearl asked. "I know what I walked away from," Nora said. "That seems like enough to start with." Pearl nodded once, slowly, as if that was the right answer. "Room's off the kitchen. Real lock on the door. Cole put it there himself 2 days ago." 2 days ago. He'd known she was coming, or someone like her was coming, before she had. That meant he had planned this, not just reacted to it. The thought settled in her chest, somewhere uncertain. "Is he a good man?" she asked. Pearl picked up her coffee. "I've met good men, and I've met useful ones. Cole's the second kind, going on the first. At his age, that's better odds than most." That night, with Danny asleep in the center of the bed, and the lock turned and the curtain drawn, Nora lay on her side and made herself breathe slowly. Outside, the desert wind had quieted into the particular silence of high basin country, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of scale. Something vast, simply being still. She was 24 years old. She had $12 in her boot, a toddler, and a job she hadn't applied for in a place she'd never heard of, working for a man she'd known for 5 hours. She also had, for the first time in 8 months, a door with a lock on it. She decided to be practical and assess in the morning. The morning was before dawn. Nora was already in the kitchen when Cole came in, and she had the stove going and was attempting to translate her knowledge of cooking for 2 into cooking for 5. There were 2 ranch hands she hadn't met yet, brothers named Walt and Jerome, she learned, who materialized from the bunkhouse like shy geology, slow-moving and careful with their words. She got through breakfast without disaster. Cole ate without complaint, which she noted. Walt said the biscuits were better than Pearl's, which earned him a look from Pearl that suggested he would regret that. The days organized themselves. There was more work than she had expected, and more variety, not just cooking and cleaning, but the keeping of records, which turned out to be in significant disorder. Cole knew cattle and land and weather. He did not know how to maintain a ledger, and the ranch's accounts showed it. 3 years of receipts in a tobacco tin, expenses recorded in no consistent system, income noted in pencil on the backs of envelopes. It took her 2 weeks to reconstruct the previous year alone. "You're missing about $40 in feed expenses," she told him one evening, spreading the reconstructed columns across the kitchen table. "And you overpaid your seed supplier by $30 in March because you didn't account for the credit from the previous invoice." Cole looked at the columns for a long moment. "How do you know that?" "My father had a hardware business. I kept his books from the time I was 11. She pointed to the entry. "You need a different system. I can set one up if you want." "Yeah," he said. "I want." He went back to reading whatever land survey he'd been studying. She went back to the ledger. Outside, the first real cold of the season was making itself known, tapping at the windows. Danny was asleep. The lamp was steady. It was, she realized somewhere in the back of her mind, almost peaceful. She did not trust peaceful. She had learned not to, but she filed the observation away. She was learning Cole Briggs the way she'd learned the ranch's accounting through small, careful observations accumulated over time. He rose before anyone else and was always already doing something when she came into the kitchen. He was patient with his horses in a specific way that told you more about a person than almost anything else could. He said more to Walt and Jerome in a single morning of fence work than he said to her in a week, which she suspected was not about her, but about the fact that ranch work had its own language, and conversation was part of it in a way that wasn't true of whatever this was. He'd been married before. She picked this up from Pearl, not from him, a woman named June who had died in childbirth 4 years ago, the baby with her. Pearl said it the way people say things they've learned to say without crying, plainly, with the details kept flat. But Nora saw the slight tightening around Pearl's eyes and understood there was more to it. She didn't ask. It wasn't her business. But she noticed that Cole never went into the southeast room of the house, and that Pearl kept the door to it closed and sometimes stood outside it for a moment before moving on. She was 3 weeks in when the first real trouble arrived. A motor car she didn't recognize pulled into the yard on a Tuesday afternoon. The man who stepped out wore a wool coat that didn't belong in ranch country and carried himself with the particular arrogance of legal authority borrowed from someone else. He asked for Cole by full name, which Pearl said the real kind of official never did. They already knew where they were going. His name was Aldous Farr. He represented the Garrett Land and Cattle Company. Cole came in from the barn with Walt half a step behind him, which Nora suspected was not an accident. Cole listened to Farr with his arms crossed and his face giving nothing, which she was learning was not indifference, but the opposite. It was the expression he wore when he was paying very close attention and didn't want you to know it. Farr's case was simple and nasty. The Garrett Company had never accepted the voiding of Roy Calloway's labor contract. Their position was that the debt had been purchased by Cole, not discharged, and that the labor obligation therefore transferred to him, meaning Nora, was now contractually obligated to the Garrett Company through Cole's ownership of the debt. That's not what the papers say, Cole said. Papers can be reinterpreted. Farr smiled the way men smile when they have money behind them. The company is willing to settle this quietly. Return the woman and child to company assignment, and we'll call the $1,200 a finder's fee. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a room full of people hears something they need a moment to believe. "Get off my property," Cole said. "Mr. Briggs." "Now?" Farr left. But his parting look at Nora was the kind that made her understand this was not finished. That evening, after Danny was asleep, Nora found Cole on the porch looking out at the dark basin. The temperature had dropped hard. She brought 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking and stood beside him. "They're not going to stop," she said. "No. What are they actually after? It isn't me." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "This land. Harlan's Reach sits on top of a water table that the Garrett Company needs for their Elko expansion. They've been trying to buy me out for 2 years. He drank his coffee. "Your leverage. They figure if they can complicate my operation enough, I'll sell to make it stop." She had not known this. The knowledge rearranged things. "So I'm a problem for you." "You're a person on my land," he said, with a firmness that surprised her. That's different. She wanted to ask him why that distinction mattered to him so personally. She didn't, because she could hear in his voice that the answer would be something real, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that yet. "Then, we need to be ready for what comes next," she said instead. He looked at her sideways. "We?" "You paid $1,200, she said. "I figure that buys you at least someone in your corner." Something moved across his face. It might have been relief. It might have been something else entirely. He looked back out at the dark. "Yeah," he said. "All right." They prepared. Cole drove to the county seat and filed documentation with the land recorder affidavits, the voided contract, a timeline of the Garrett Company's approach. Nora wrote it all out in her clearest hand and organized it so that any county official could follow the argument without assistance. Pearl, who turned out to have opinions about the Garrett Company that predated Nora's arrival by a decade, provided a statement of her own that she dictated to Nora word for word with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity. Walt and Jerome, consulted as to whether they wanted to be involved, looked at each other and then at Cole and said, almost simultaneously, that they'd been with Harlan's Reach for 4 years and didn't figure that changed today. 3 weeks after Farr's visit, a county sheriff's deputy arrived with a civil summons requiring Cole to appear and dispute the Garrett Company's claim in front of a land magistrate. Cole went. Nora went with him. because she was the subject of the dispute, and because she had organized the documentation, and because by that point it was simply obvious that she would be there. The hearing was in the county seat, in a wood-paneled room that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. The Garrett Company's attorney was a man named Pelham, who had the smooth, relentless quality of a river wearing down stone. He presented the company's interpretation of the contract with the confidence of someone who'd won this argument before. Nora had anticipated this. She had spent 3 evenings reading every land and labor statute she could find in the county clerk's reference collection, which Pearl had driven her to access by insisting they had business in town and simply parking in front of the records office. When the magistrate asked if Cole had documentation, Cole looked at Nora. She stood up, which was not exactly encouraged, and presented the voided contract, the payment record, the statutory language that made the Garrett Company's interpretation not just wrong, but specifically prohibited under the 1907 Nevada Labor Reform Act, and a letter from a Reno attorney she had written to and received a reply from at her own initiative, confirming the same. Pelham objected to her standing. "She's the subject of the dispute," the magistrate said mildly. "I think she's got standing." They won. Cleanly, in writing, with a magistrate's order that the Garrett Company was to cease all action regarding the Calloway labor contract, which was void, and regarding the persons of Nora and Daniel Calloway, who were free of any company obligation. Cole didn't say anything on the drive back. He didn't need to. Walt, who had come along and waited outside, said everything necessary when he saw their faces. He took off his hat and hit it against his knee and said, "Hot damn," with enormous feeling, which made Danny laugh. That night, Pearl made a dinner that was not a normal dinner. There was a pie. Nora didn't know where the ingredients had come from and didn't ask. Afterward, Danny had fallen asleep at the table and had been carried to bed by Jerome, who had very gently and seriously accepted the responsibility. The kitchen was quiet. Pearl had gone to her room. Walt and Jerome were in the bunkhouse. It was just Nora and Cole and the last of the lamp oil. "You wrote to an attorney," Cole said. "I wrote to 3. He was the only one who answered quickly enough." "Where'd you get the stamps?" "Pearl." He nodded slowly, absorbing this. "You didn't have to do any of that." "Yes, I did." She looked at him across the table. "You need someone in your corner who knows how the paperwork works. You know the land and the cattle and the weather." "The paper is mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you stay? You could have taken your wages and left 2 weeks in. Garrett wouldn't have been able to touch you once the first filing was in." She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it specifically, in the particular way she thought about things she needed to be honest about rather than comfortable about. "I stayed because it's the first place since my father's house where something was being built," she said. "Not just maintained, built. And I wanted to be part of something being built." He looked at her for a long time. His face in the low lamplight was difficult to read, and she'd gotten better at reading it. "June," he said. She waited. She wanted to leave. Not because she didn't love the ranch she did, but because it was too far from everything, too hard, too uncertain. His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it. The specific flatness of grief that's been carried so long, it's shaped itself to the container. "I kept asking her to wait until the next season, the next year, when things were more settled. She died waiting for me to understand what she was asking." Nora didn't say she was sorry. It seemed too small. "I'm not her," she said finally. "I know." He looked at his hands. "That's why I'm telling you." She understood what he was doing. He was giving her the worst thing, the failure, the grief, the guilt, handing it to her before she could discover it on her own and wonder what he'd been keeping. It was the most honest thing anyone had done for her in years, and it hit her somewhere she wasn't expecting. "Cole," she said, "I'm not looking for perfect. I'm not looking for easy. I spent 3 years watching a good man run from a debt he was too ashamed to name, and it killed him." She straightened the papers on the table that didn't need straightening. "What I'm looking for is someone who stays when it's hard and tells the truth when it's uncomfortable." She looked at him. "You've done both." He held her gaze. "I'm going to tell you something," he said slowly, "and I need you to know I'm not saying it because of tonight or because of the hearing. I've been trying to find the right time for 3 weeks, and I've decided there isn't one, so I'm just going to say it. All right. I'd like to know if you'd consider staying, not as an employee." He said it the way he said everything important plainly, without decorating it. "I'd like to know if you'd consider staying as a permanent arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. As your wife. Yeah. You've known me for 2 months. I've been alive for 36 years, he said. I know what I'm looking at. She thought about it genuinely, because she owed both of them that. She thought about Roy, who she had loved in a young, easy way that hadn't been tested until suddenly it was everything, and then it was gone. She thought about what she'd said about wanting to be part of something being built. She thought about Pearl, and the way Danny reached for Cole when Cole came into a room now, which had started about 3 weeks ago, and which she had been watching with a feeling she couldn't quite name. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded, as if that was exactly what he'd expected. Okay. He got up, rinsed his cup, and went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table for another hour, listening to the house settle in the cold. She thought about what Pearl had said the first night. Good men and useful ones. Cole's the second kind going on the first. The thing about a man going on toward good was that it was a direction. It meant he wasn't done. She decided that morning when Danny climbed into her bed and put both hands on her face and said, with the absolute authority of a child who has identified what he needs, Ma, eat, she decided then. The wedding was in April, when the basin was coming back green from the winter rains, and the cattle were fat on new grass, and the accounts, which Nora had fully reconstructed and systematized, showed a profit margin that made Cole look at the numbers twice and then quietly outside so nobody would see him allow himself to feel it. Pearl stood with them in the yard, in the thin spring sunlight. Walt and Jerome wore their good shirts, which they kept in a box under Walt's bunk for occasions. Danny, who was 2 and had recently developed strong opinions about hats, wore Cole's hat for the entirety of the ceremony because Cole had put it on him as a joke, and Danny had decided it was non-negotiable. The county justice said the words. Cole said his plainly and without ceremony, which was right for him. Nora said hers and meant every syllable. When it was done, Pearl produced a bottle she had been keeping for what she described only as the right thing. And Walt played harmonica badly but with great enthusiasm, and Danny fell asleep in the middle of it all in Jerome's arms, wearing the hat. The Garrett Company made one more attempt a letter 6 months later, suggesting Cole might want to reconsider selling the water rights. Nora wrote the reply. She kept it professional and clear, and used the phrase, as previously established by magistrate order, 4 times, because she had found that repeating the phrase made certain kinds of men understand it was not going to change. They did not write again. The years at Harlan's Reach were not easy, because nothing real is easy, but they were good in the specific way that things earned with your own hands are good. The ranch grew. The water table that the Garrett Company had wanted turned out to be even more significant than they'd known, and Cole sold water rights to 2 neighboring operations on favorable terms that built relationships rather than obligations. Nora managed the contracts. She was better at it than he was, and he knew it and said so, which was one of the things she loved about him. He did not require himself to be the best at everything. Danny grew up calling Cole Pa with the easy certainty of a child who has never had reason to question it, which was the most uncomplicated happiness Nora had ever witnessed. He learned to ride before he was 4. He had Cole's steadiness and Nora's precision with numbers, and Pearl's absolute refusal to accept imprecision in anything he chose to care about. Pearl stayed until she was 81, when she announced one evening at supper that she was going to live with her daughter in Sacramento because, she said, she had been meaning to for 15 years, and she didn't see the point in waiting until she couldn't make the trip. She left on a Tuesday with 1 trunk and Jerome driving her to the train station, and she hugged Nora for a long time at the door and said, in a voice that did not crack, "You did right. You both did right." Jerome and Walt eventually moved on Jerome to a ranch of his own up north, Walt to a hardware business in Reno that he ran with his brother. They came back every few years, and the kitchen was always loud when they did. 2 more children came, a daughter named Ruth, who had Nora's dark hair and Cole's silence, and a gift for horses that bypassed both of them entirely and seemed to arrive from some further back branch of the family, and a son named Henry, who was loud and joyful from the first moment and stayed that way. On a morning in late autumn, many years after the hearing in the county seat, after the Garrett Company had dissolved in a bankruptcy that nobody at Harlan's Reach mourned, Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched Cole come in from the far pasture. He was older now, slower in the way of men whose bodies have logged decades of hard work, but his pace was still deliberate, still his. Danny was running the North operation. Ruth had a horse training business that used 3 of Harlan's Reach's best pastures and had a 2-year waiting list. Henry was in college in Reno, studying civil engineering and sending letters home that were too long and wonderful. Cole came through the back door and stood in the kitchen the way he had 10,000 mornings before this one, and Nora handed him coffee without looking up from the letter she was writing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The year-end numbers. We need to talk about the Jerome pasture lease when Danny's here Thursday." "Yeah." He sat down. "What else?" She looked up. After this many years, she knew what he was asking. "I was thinking about a Tuesday afternoon in Dustin's flat," she said. "And a man who paid $1,200 for a woman he'd never met?" Cole wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Good investment," he said mildly. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. I said you were the most competent person I'd ever met last February. That was the most romantic thing. This is just true." He smiled, which he still did the same way he always had, slowly, from the inside out, like a fire catching. "You ever regret it?" "Staying." She set down her pen. She gave the question the honesty it deserved, which was what she'd always given him. "I came to Dustin's flat with a toddler and $12 in my boot," she said. "I thought my life was a thing that had happened to me, that I was the sum of what Roy's debt had made me." She looked at him steadily. "I learned different." "What'd you learn?" "That a life isn't something that happens to you," she said. "It's something you build, piece by piece, decision by decision, in the direction of the thing you're trying to make." She picked up her pen again. "I learned that from watching you do it. And then I did it myself." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't doing it until you came. I was just holding on." She looked at him. "You made it a thing worth building toward," he said plainly. The way he said everything that mattered. Outside, the Nevada basin spread wide under the autumn sun, the grass going golden now, the cattle moving slow in the far pastures, the mountains steady on the horizon. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the cold that would be serious by next week. Everything in this room had been fought for, organized, calculated, defended, and chosen, not once but daily, in the way that things worth keeping have to be chosen. Nora finished her letter. Cole finished his coffee, and Harlan's Reach went on being built. Nora didn't wait to be rescued. She picked up a pen and learned the law. That's the quiet truth at the heart of her story. The people who help us matter. But what saves us in the end is the decision to stay in the fight one more day, to trust one more person, to build one more thing, even when everything we built before has burned. A life worth living isn't handed to you. It's chosen, repaired, and chosen again. A small note for you, this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment and, hopefully, a little warmth to carry into your own day.